Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final session of our Stream 4 on AI, on the opportunities and impact. Thank you all for joining us, and thanks to Catherine Beckett, who has escaped, I see, for her excellent and seamless organization of this. I'm Morgan Wasco, and I am happy to be the Rocos Fellow and Tutor in Physics here at Pembroke. I've been working in the exciting field of neutrino physics, experimental neutrino physics, for over 20 years, and have been working on and leading international collaborations at the Fermi National Accelerator Lab in the United States and the High Energy Accelerator Lab in Japan. AI tools are becoming more easily accessible and more effective than ever before, and their complexity is growing so rapidly that it's difficult to stay abreast of their capabilities and their limits. This leads to both excitement about the growing number of uses and trepidation about their startling power. I also think that the rapidity of the growth has led to considerable confusion about what's actually possible and what's coming next. That excitement, trepidation, and confusion pervade academia as well as wider society. That's what motivates the discussion topic today. In a few moments, I'll have the pleasure of introducing you to our panelists. Each is involved in research surrounding the opportunities and the impact of AI, but there are many others not here today, or at least not in the room, who are part of that picture, and I'd like to spend a few minutes mentioning them. Across our community, Pembrokians are studying the use of AI in medicine, robotics, geopolitics, law, physics, business, finance, cybersecurity, and more. Some are involved in research and development, others seeking to understand the implications on the way that our society forms. In the medical field, Pembroke Junior Research Fellow Paula Dieman is involved in research evaluating the use of AI in early diagnosis of cancer and other medical predictions, while our Computer Science Fellow Professor Anna Nambarete has recently used AI to construct the first digital atlas of fetal brain development. Professor Nick Hawes, the Fellow in Engineering, specializes in AI techniques for the creation of intelligent autonomous robots that can work with humans. An alumnus, Professor Mark Thompson, is Executive Chair of the Science and Technology Facilities Council, which supports research projects in particle physics, including my neutrino experiments, nuclear physics, astronomy, and many other fields involving artificial intelligence. Some of our Pembrokians take an important step back to consider the implications of AI. Philosophy Fellow Professor Guy Kahane studies ethical issues surrounding artificial intelligence and its adoption in our everyday life. And Law Fellow Professor Ariel Ezrahi, his research applies his expertise to competition law to the changing landscapes of AI, exploring the impact it might have on markets. Bridging the gap between academia and the public, several alumni are engaged in communicating AI with a wider audience, such as Verity Harding, who is the founder of a technology consultancy that supports businesses with AI transition, and published her book AI Needs You earlier this year, which is designed to explain how ordinary people should get involved in the AI industry. Katie Prescott documents the ongoing real-world impact of AI in her role as technology business editor at the Times, bringing key stories about technology, media, and telecoms to readers. These are just a few of the examples of the many Pembrokians engaged with the sector here in college and across the globe. And today we're very fortunate to be able to hear from 4 of those individuals in this panel discussion. So before I introduce the panelists, I want to draw your attention to our Slido online question format. So there will be time towards the end of the session for the panel to address issues you've raised or come back to something that you'd like to hear more about in detail. For those of you not familiar with the Slido format, on the screen you'll see here a QR code. So you just pull out your phone and you can scan it, and it'll bring you up to a web interface where you can submit a comment or a question of your own, or upvote, or add one of those entered by others. So you can imagine, just type it in. Tell me more about Morgan's research. Yes. Did I say that out loud? Sorry. Alternatively, if you prefer, we'll also have some microphones, and we'll have the more traditional roving mic technique, and you can ask your question in person. So on to the introductions of those who are here today to share their thoughts and expertise. We're delighted to welcome back alumna Jen Easterly, who studied at Pembroke as a Rhodes Scholar and joins us today coming from the US, where she serves as Director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency. Since her nomination by President Biden and subsequent confirmation in 2021, Jen has led the CISA's efforts to understand, manage, and reduce risks to the cyber and physical infrastructure that Americans rely on every day. And prior to that role, she's worked in cybersecurity at Morgan Stanley, in 2 other security roles at the White House, and for 20 years in intelligence and cyber operations for the US Army. Jen's joined by Professor Ingmar Posner, who's a Pembroke Fellow and a founding director of the Oxford Robotics Institute. Ingmar's Professor of Applied Artificial Intelligence at the Oxford Department of Engineering Science and leads the Applied Artificial Intelligence Lab, aiming to enable robots to operate effectively in complex real-world environments. His research, which focuses on real-world robotics applications such as autofocus driving, logistics, and space exploration, has received multiple awards and frequent coverage in national and international press. And in 2014, he co-founded OXA, formerly Oxbotica, a leading provider of autonomous vehicle software. And he currently serves as an Amazon Scholar. Our panel is completed by Professor Rebecca Williams, a fellow in law and co-founder of Oxford's LawTech education program and co-convener of the Law and Computer Science course. Her research is increasingly focused on the relationship between law and technology and the ways in which the law will need to keep pace with technological developments. She's involved in large-scale multidisciplinary projects exploring the potential of artificial intelligence for English law. And the panel is chaired by Andrew Pitt, a history alumnus of Pembroke and currently global head of research at leading global bank Citi. Since 2021, he's managed all research and content services across Citi, including the bank's central data science team, which uses many AI applications. In 2012, Andrew launched the Citi GPS public research program, which he's led ever since. Andrew's team works with individuals, universities, and research institutes, including the Oxford Martin School, to create solutions for the greatest challenges and opportunities of the 21st century, not least the impact of technology on the economy and society. So Andrew, with thanks for doing so, it's over to you to lead the discussion.
Generations that came after phenomenally wealthy as well. So the question I think is AI in that vein, or is AI something different? Is AI something that will save us, or will it kill us? I think there's probably a lot of hype at the moment, and I think we'll probably get into that on this panel. But let's see, and we'd love to get everybody in the audience engaged as well. So obviously, we're going to questions, but I'm sure there's a number of you who work in the field as well. And one of the things we'll try and get into on the panel is a little chat about education as well, and what it means for the next 400 years of Pembroke in terms of AI there. So the way we're going to do this is I'm going to ask Ingmar, Jen, Becca the same first question, very sort of high-level question to get things going. Then I'm going to give a little overview of how I think you frame the questions around AI that we need to consider, and then we'll get into some sort of hopefully really, really deep dialogue around that. So starting with that, maybe if I start with you, Ingmar, because it starts with the tech. Briefly, what does AI mean for you? What does it mean for you in your job, in your world? And at a high level, are we at a critical moment in human history?
Okay, many questions. So, what does it mean, glibly speaking? We think about machines that act or behave in some way intelligently. It's debatable whether that's necessarily like humans, but in some way intelligently. And there's actually a lot to unpack because for the past 80 years, when artificial intelligence was sort of a thing, a research area, we've been trying to figure out what that actually means. As a culture, as a society, as humanity, we've been trying to figure that out for hundreds of years. Right? So there's not an obvious answer to that, and I don't think you'll find the one true definition. In the context of my own work, where we think about robotics and AI and sort of agents interacting in the real world, it really is about having artificial agents, robots, for example, that are able to perceive and to reason and to act in some context in their own environment in a way that is purposeful, that is ultimately successful, autonomously, that's one thing, and then a big emphasis often is also put on being able to adapt during deployment, right, in such a way that can be done. Now, there are many more things to be said about that, but I want to stress this notion of perceiving and reasoning and acting, because AI is not a thing. AI is actually many things. We don't quite know what it is, or these sort of things are qualitatively different. So we can say many things about classical AI problems that have very much to do with planning. And Jen and I, we earlier talked about the Rubik's Cube, right? And so we can talk about that, and as computer scientists, we can say very strong things about how we want to solve these problems and how we can solve these problems. But if you think about, how do I know that this is a pen and that this is actually an object, qualitatively, these are very different problems. And we could spend a long time just picking that apart.
Or we probably will. So,
excellent.
Thanks, Ingmar. So Jen, obviously, huge responsibility with your job. What does AI mean for you, and do you think we're at a pivotal moment?
Yeah. So great to be with you all. Great to be back at Pembroke. So let me just say three things at the outset. First of all, CISA, because folks probably have never heard of it, because it's the newest agency in the federal government. We're roughly equivalent to the National Cybersecurity Center and the National Public Safety Agency. So if you put those two things together, we serve as America's civilian cyber defense agency and as the national coordinator for critical infrastructure resilience and security. So we lead the national effort to reduce risk to the cyber and physical infrastructure that Americans rely on, like water and power and transportation and communication and healthcare and education, and all of the infrastructure that Americans use to cast and count ballots. So we're in charge of election infrastructure, and we may want to talk a little bit about the nexus between AI and elections as well. But so that's sort of what we do. Second, where it touches our world in cybersecurity and infrastructure security, we were talking about this with Morgan earlier. So we've been using AI for a very long time. We just called it machine learning before. But with some of the newest capabilities, specifically the large language models and the generative AI capabilities, there has been a huge amount of work done by the US federal government over the last 2 years to sort of wrap our arms around how can we optimize the use of these new capabilities but mitigate the harms. And so my agency, CISA, operates at the nexus of AI, cyber defense, and critical infrastructure. And we've been tasked by the White House to do basically three things. First, red teaming to ensure the safety and security of generative AI capabilities. Second, to figure out how we can use the capabilities better for cybersecurity, detection of threats, cyber defense. So we're running pilots with some of the new capabilities coming from industry to try and drive down risk to threats to our infrastructure systems. And then third, we're looking at specifically AI threats to that full range of critical infrastructure. And so we've published some guidelines for critical infrastructure owners and operators who are beginning to integrate artificial intelligence into their systems about what they need to do to mitigate risk. And the third thing I'll say is, as a security agency, obviously we want to think about how we can use these capabilities to make our mission easier, but we have a real focus on the safety and security side to prevent harms from some of these very powerful, unpredictable, fast-moving capabilities. So we've been working since the Bletchley Summit last year on guidelines for generative AI companies on how to build these capabilities to be safe and secure. And we can talk a little bit more about this from a technology perspective, but we're at 400 years for Pembroke. If you go back to 40 years when computers started talking to each other through new protocols, security has never been a priority for technology. It's why we have an internet full of viruses, why we have software full of vulnerabilities, why we have social media that is full of disinformation. And so the legal aspects, which is why I'm so excited that Becca's here, the legal aspects, the regulatory aspects about this incredible moving, fast-moving technology, I think are perhaps the most important aspect of what we need to talk about.
Yeah, thank you. Great introduction. Have we decided how quickly the machines do solve the Rubik Cube now?
Sadly, they're like 0.36,
Okay.
which makes me very sad.
Okay.
I'll never get there.
That's okay.
Fantastic.
They're allowed to be better at some things than you. That's okay.
So Becca, so again, initial for you. So, what's AI mean in your world at the moment, and where do you think? Well, maybe where do you think we are in the world of education, very high level as well?
So I think in my own work, it's extremely central now. I've come to this from a background. I was saying to Jen before that I really started off as a very ordinary criminal and public lawyer and really didn't know anything at all about the technology, but I could see sort of down the road the impact that this was starting to have on my fields, just in terms of things like governments using algorithms to make welfare or immigration decisions or risk assessments for recidivism for sentencing purposes and all this kind of thing. So I realised I needed to get ahead of what was happening in my fields, and then it sort of dawned on me that actually the same thing was true really of all lawyers, but that not everybody had kind of woken up to that fact yet, and not everybody had realised quite what an impact this was going to have and what a role we were going to have to play, and also how much that role was going to differ from the role that we've played in the past, because in the past we have talked, about technology, and we have talked with technologists in terms of regulation, but I think never before has there been such a really vital importance in terms of talking to the people who work with this stuff and having a really kind of iterative, cyclical relationship to pick up on that point about regulation. Unless we understand what the tech is doing, we can't match it up to the rules that we currently have or want to have, and we can't create rules that will work unless, when we go back to the tech people, it will actually work with what they're doing. So I think it's a kind of unique point in terms of the need for interdisciplinarity in law that we haven't really had anything quite like before.
And do you think we're at a big moment in human history now? We have to get a grip on this?
Potentially, yes. I mean, the difficulty is getting a grip on something that you don't really know exactly what it is or where it is. So that's the challenge that we have. But yeah.
Yeah, great, thank you. Well, I think that sets the scene, sort of three wonderful perspectives there. Let me just give you all a few moments of perspective of how I see the world. I have to run a research team that looks at all aspects of this, looks at the economy, looks at technology, looks at healthcare. We don't have lawyers and ethicists with us, but I think one of the most important things is what's happening now is building on something that's been building up itself for over 70 years. So if you look at the sort of rise of AI, starting, I think, when the term was coined in the 1950s, with machine intelligence, then moving into machine learning, deep learning, with IBM Watson being launched in 2010. I remember a lot of people pitching that at me in the time as being a game changer. But really the sort of motion we're in at the moment, which is generative AI, and obviously the hype around the launch of ChatGPT, which was the 30th of November 2022, and everything that's come from there. So the question really is, with the technology, are we at a state now where we have what we call artificial general intelligence, which is essentially where machines are as intelligent as all of us? And will we get to a point in the future where we have artificial superintelligence, where they are dramatically more intelligent? My view at the moment, and I'm not the tech specialist on this, is actually in many ways we are at artificial general intelligence now. Machines are already better at image recognition, reading comprehension, speech recognition, exam completion. ChatGPT also allegedly has an IQ of about 160 as well, if you look at it from that perspective. So I think we're pretty close. And then some people say to me, but what are the essential human skills of communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and creativity? Again, I would argue at the moment we're getting pretty close in AI to many of those. Probably not collaboration yet, although in some extent, by how you want to define that, it's happening. But machines, I think, are certainly creative. They're certainly thinking critically, and they're certainly communicating. The world I inhabit is absolutely full of money sloshing around looking at this. I can't bump into someone who isn't invested in AI in some shape or form. I worry in the public markets there's a bit of a bubble growing in the stock market at the moment. I'm happy to talk about that. I've been in the industry for a long years, and some things happening at the moment remind me of the internet bubble back in 2000, 2001. But there's a lot of money betting on what's going to happen here. The question I get my research team to look at is, does this solve the big issues that confront us? So how does AI fit in with what is the bigger framework of things out in the world? And I think there's 4 big things in the world that we should care about, of which one is the technology itself. So I'll come to that last. Very briefly, the first big thing that we're all grappling with are macro and geopolitical issues. So we're all dealing with the scar tissue of the financial crisis, the pandemic, and obviously the current war in Europe. We've got very high levels of public debt, taxation, creeping public services. We've got the rise of populist nationalism, and we've got geopolitical tensions. If you think all that through, how do governments and corporations manage that? AI impacts huge amounts of all of that, either with disinformation through nationalism, geopolitical actions. We'll probably talk with Jen about the US and China in terms of the arms race that's going on there with technology, but also just helping us. Is AI going to be our saviour with the economic peril that we find ourselves in? So you can't extract it from the geopolitical and macro debate. You can't extract it from the climate debate. And actually there I'm probably more optimistic. I think AI as a force for helping us solve some of the issues in climate and nature, particularly food, is going to be very important and probably more realisable over the next 20 to 30 years. But for example, we're in a situation at the moment where, cleaning up behind us, by 2050, about half the people in the world will be relying on imported food, and that itself will rely on a lot of technologies that AI will drive. And then we come on to demographics, which again, and this is where I think AI has to be critical going one way or the other. In the advanced economies, we're dealing with a rapidly aging population. So is tech going to be our saviour there in terms of growth and productivity, and even dealing with the greater population of older folks we'll have? And some of these changes are quite profound, and I don't think they get talked about as much in the overall hype around AI. So if you look at an economy like Japan that everybody knows is aging, its population is also collapsing. So Japan, by the end of the century, will probably only have about 75 million people. It's got about 120 million now. If you look at China, there's something that's absolutely staggering. China has about 1.3 million inhabitants now. It's probably only going to be at about 800 at the end of this century. So there's some quite profound things happening in demographics, which AI has to come and either solve or exacerbate. And then there's the tech itself, which I think we're going to talk about. Are we at turning points with generative AI, with embodied AI, a lot of the work that Ingmar does with robots and with quantum computing? So what I think matters with all of this, this is how I think of framing the questions. I think 3 things up front. I think we're in a short ride in a very fast machine at the moment, because I think AI is built on an existing infrastructure that allows progress to happen very fast now. It took the internet 7 years to reach 50 million people. It took ChatGPT a month. Now, the reason it took the internet 7 years, we can all see, is because computing was less in society generally. So things have moved at the speed of light. AI, general purpose AI, is broadly democratic. It's open source. It doesn't have borders. And there's just so much money invested in it. So I think we need to take on that. And I think this is why we're at a critical moment. The other thing I think a lot about is it has a huge impact on knowledge workers, which is something we'll probably come back to. And I don't believe there's adequate governance, which again is what we'll talk about going through the panel here. So I think these are the questions I think we all have to think about as society. So where are we with the tech itself? Economically, will it generate growth and productivity? And what will the consequences be on jobs and wages? What are the areas where AI can help us, whether it's climate, nature, other areas, without introducing too much risk into the system? What are the risks, whether they're innocent risks, bad actor risks, or truly existential risks? And how do we govern all of this? How do we govern it with law, regulation, ethics? And then a question we probably won't answer, which is, will we all be happier at the end of this? Although I do try and read some philosophy around that as well. So that's how I kind of frame the question. So let's get going. So Ingmar, let's say, where do you think we are with the technology at the moment? So if you sort of pose the question, do we have artificial general intelligence now? Do we think we've reached that point? No. And also, do you think we're at a point now where the technology itself is moving so much faster than the implementation of its technology that the two of them have to come together, that business isn't adopting what we already have sufficiently?
Okay, so let me try to unpack that. Do we have artificial general intelligence? The answer is no, just unequivocally no. The slightly more interesting question around that is, if we had it, would we know? And like, how would we define it? And the answer is, well, ultimately, we don't even know what makes each other intelligent, right? Like, I can't look at all of you and say, clearly, you're on your beings, you have your own intelligence. We only have phenomenological observations, right? I can look at how you act, I can try and apply my internal model and how you act, and I can sort of not just anthropomorphize, but sort of humanize, Ingmarize you in my head and kind of try and predict what you're doing with that, right? And that is a particular skill, and as humans we've evolved to be able to do that. Why? Because otherwise there's so much data out there that we don't really know how to deal with it in any sort of other way. That's the context we expect. The way that artificial intelligence systems work these days is actually fundamentally different. An AI system is much more akin to one that has an enormous capacity to almost remember most things. Okay? The problem is, though, of course, you can't remember all things because you have to store them somehow. So we try and find ways of somehow summarizing them, or the systems try and find ways to summarize them, and they do that statistically, right? So, for example, if I've said the sentence, the cat is on the, most of you will probably go, the mat, right? And the reason for that is because you've heard that example many, many times before. That's a statistical thing, right? There's nothing to do with the fact that most cats often sit on mats or anything, right? So it's to do with the data that has come into that. And ultimately, when you then talk about critical thinking, not really. So there isn't really any critical thinking going on. We can talk. So this is a bit of a glib and overarching comment. And if we talk about this in more depth, we can talk about to what degree there is introspection going on and actual reasoning in the logic sense. But the models that we tend to talk about here do not do that. And in fact, they can't do that right now. And one of the big frontiers is trying to get them to do that, so we get rid of things like imagination and all that sort of stuff, which is funny because most of my career people were like, creativity is not a thing, imagination is not a thing. How could we possibly do this? And now everybody complains about it, which is funny. For all the right reasons, by the way. They complain about it for the right reasons. Anyway, so are we at an inflection point? We're undoubtedly experiencing a technological revolution, without a doubt. To some degree, it's a renaissance, because for those of you who know about the AI winter, we were in this place before when we said AI can do many useful things, and then somebody wrote a report and all funding got cancelled because, frankly, we massively, as a community, massively overpromised what it was able to do. We're now at a place where the AI systems that come out are actually much more useful in the public domain and commercially than we've ever been before. That is definitely true. And the reason for that is actually threefold. Like any good revolution, you have a bunch of reasons that come together, right? And the first one is computing. There's a reason why NVIDIA, every now and then is the most valuable company, publicly traded company in the world. The algorithmic component has come together, even though when people talk to you about this new thing called deep learning, the algorithmic basis for that has been around since the 60s, right? So it's just the fact that this came together with a lot of compute that we can do and also some algorithmic refinement around that. And the last thing is data. So the reason why we can develop whatever you want to call these models, foundation models, anything like large language models, vision language models, anything like that, any GPT type model, is because we have access to all of the data that humanity has ever created via this thing called the internet, and that's a key enabler. It's also an interesting business case around how you build those models, but we can talk about that. We can talk about that later.
Yeah, no. And so, do you think it even matters to pose the question: is there artificial general intelligence, or are we near it?
It depends. I think if you're a philosopher or if you're interested in the nature of intelligence, oh my God, it matters. Yes, I care about it. If you want to get stuff done because you have a business interest, I don't think it matters.
So what would you say in terms of where you think the tech itself, impressive though it is at the moment, still needs breakthroughs? What are the sort of frontiers that you see potentially being breached in the next 3 to 5 years?
So right now there's a lot of issues around, we talked about critical reasoning, being able to introspect on what these models actually produce. There is, so not so much from the AI perspective, but certainly from the deployment perspective, a significant need for innovation around security, So things like watermarking and so on because of misinformation and misuse. And there's an interesting exploitation sort of conversation to be had around that. One very, very big deal is energy. These systems are unbelievably energy hungry. And that's bad for two reasons. One, it makes the ice caps melt. The second reason is it's really difficult to deploy this thing on your smartphone. So if we all want to be benefiting from these models, and I can give you a concrete example of where this sort of thing matters in a minute. But if we want to benefit from these models and be able to use them readily without too much both financial but also economic, environmental, and so on cost, we need to find ways of making the model smaller and also the way that we design the compute much more efficient. And all of that is currently ongoing.
Thank you. So Jen, maybe if I turn to you and think about, based on where we are at the moment with the technology as well, and as I said, the evolution of the technology, so everything that's built on what's gone before, how do you see the risk landscape with AI at the moment? And maybe sort of between sort of innocent risk and bad actor risk, and how do you see that, and how do you see that evolving?
That's exactly right. You have to look at both. You know, something Ingmar said kind of sparked something in me. You talked about imagination. Right. One of the inflection points in my own career was as a young Army major, I was the executive assistant to Condoleezza Rice when she was the National Security Advisor, and was with her when she had to testify before the 9/11 Commission. And during that time, the co-chairman, a guy called Tom Kane of the 9/11 Commission, talked about, on that day we were terribly unprepared. We had not grasped the magnitude of a threat that had been growing for some considerable period of time. It was a failure of management, a failure of capability, and a failure of policy, but above all, a failure of imagination. And that affected me very seriously then, and it's been sort of thematic throughout what I've tried to do for the rest of my career. But I do think it is the responsibility of all leaders to be able to leverage the power of imagination while avoiding the failure of imagination. And certainly the world's imagination has been captured by these capabilities really since GPT came out. But, I think it was Paul Virilio who talked about it. When you invent the plane, you invent the plane crash. When you invent the train, you invent the train wreck. When you invent electricity, you invent electrocution. And so to your point, there is malicious use of these capabilities. There's unintentional harms that can come from these capabilities. I think from my perspective, we should just all stipulate that there will be amazing things that come from these capabilities. They will make our lives easier, they will make our lives better, but they will also make lives better and easier for our adversaries who will attempt to do unimaginable harm with them, whether that's terrorists or cyber criminals or nation-state adversaries like Russia or China, Iran, North Korea that I deal with every day. And so when you look at, and I agree, you do this more than I do, but I think AGI we're probably a decade off or so. But these technologies, we can argue about that. These technologies are moving faster than any technology before. They're unpredictable, and they're very powerful. And so not only will they be the most powerful tech, I think they will also be the most powerful weapons. And we know the most powerful weapons of the last century, nuclear weapons, were built and safeguarded by governments who were disincentivized to use them. These capabilities broadly are being built by the private sector, who at the end of the day have a fiduciary responsibility to provide shareholder value. And so the incentives, you're going to talk about the economics portion of this, and the incentives from an economics perspective are a pretty serious piece of how these capabilities will be used, how they'll be governed, how they'll be controlled. And at the end of the day, where this technology is moving versus where the governance and regulations and the rules are moving are incredibly misaligned. And while it's okay, the reason we have a cybersecurity industry is because there were never regulations put on software or technology. And those are the things that I worry about. And yes, I worry about unintentional harm, but I really worry about these capabilities being used by powerful adversaries to do intentional harm. And I think we are close to that happening in the near term.
Okay, so that might be a frontier we really do have to worry about. Actually, I mean, Jennifer, just stuck on what I was calling sort of the innocent risks of this, the sort of the unintended consequences. The costs are pretty high. I mean, you and I have talked about that. I mean, the costs of just bad software, probably to talk a little bit about what sort of cybersecurity is costing the planet at the moment.
Yeah, well, one of our big initiatives at CISA, and we've been working with our international partners on this as well, is called creating tech that is secure by design. Because at the end of the day, neither the internet nor software was created with security as the top priority. It was always about speed to market and cool features, and security was a bolt-on, and thus the multi-billion-dollar cybersecurity industry, because again, there was nothing regulating technology or software. And if you look at some of the statistics around global cybercrime, it's estimated to cost the world $10.5 trillion by the year 2025. We know just the software damage that comes from vulnerabilities found in software. I think for the US it was $2.14 trillion for last year. And so these are, I think, things that we should have forefront of mind when we think about the need to put rules in place for these types of technologies. And I think, Becca makes a very good point that we need to understand them better to effectively put the guardrails on. And so I do think it needs to be a collaboration and partnership. That's certainly how we're approaching it from a US perspective. But oftentimes you'll hear, well, the government has no idea how to put regulations in place, so just let industry regulate themselves, which I also think is a horribly bad idea. But whatever we do, I think the burden needs to be on us to do it as quickly as possible, or we'll suffer the AI equivalent of the harms that we're suffering from ransomware attacks and poor software, which again is in the trillions.
No, thank you. I mean, just to put one thing Jen said into context there, obviously competing with something else. One thing,
It's the wine.
yeah.
Bring some back.
I knew it.
Just put one thing Jen said into context there. So that, maybe that cyber will cost the global economy 10.5 trillion. That's 10% of global GDP. And I think, Jen, that number's forecast to grow at quite a compound rate, maybe up to about 15 billion. By the end of the decade. So when you look at some of the forecasts, and maybe we'll talk about those later, for what AI might do for productivity in the economy, it's actually somewhat smaller than actually what these issues are. Perversely for the economists out there, you can actually get GDP driven from losses in industry and so on, in terms of how the accounting is done. But I don't think it's a particularly healthy equation. So thinking about that, Becca, sort of, how do we regulate?
Yeah,
and how do we create laws for all of this?
It's a really difficult question. I mean, obviously, otherwise we would have done it, and we would have done it really well, and we haven't yet. So it is obviously a really difficult question. I mean, to go back to one of the things I was saying before, as well as being more interdisciplinary than we've ever been in terms of regulation, we also need to be more iterative and more rapidly than we've ever been before. And you are starting to see this. So both the US executive order, which basically had the whole approach of that is upfront information gathering before a period of regulation. The AI Act in the EU has done it slightly the other way around. It's sort of gone out there with regulation initially, but with lots of provisions in that Act for the Commission to update things, to change things, to add things, to improve on things. And I think that's something which, as lawyers, we're not really used to going back to our work, 5 minutes later and checking it was okay in quite the same way. But I think we need to start thinking about beta testing the regulation in the way that you would do with the system. And that's something that's quite a new technique to lawyers who are quite used to sort of regulating something, producing legislation, and sitting back and letting it get on with itself. So I think that's a really key aspect of it. It's really interesting also to hear Jen saying, and it's kind of really nice actually to hear you saying as much as you are about the need for protection and the need for regulation, because very often in this space you get a lot of, but you don't want to stifle innovation, you don't want to stop people being able to do things, and all for productivity and all the rest of it, we need this. And so I think being able to say, well, no, actually both those concerns are really important. That's why you need the iteration, because you want to go back and check that you've struck the right balance. And if you haven't struck the right balance, you want to be able to do something about that. So we are starting to see these pieces of regulation coming through. But the other thing, what's the other things really that I would say about that? One of them is that we actually do already have quite a lot of law in place that could potentially be helpful. So there is this sort of tendency to say, oh, new technology equals new law. We definitely need a new piece of... And actually, sometimes when we've done that, we go really quite wrong. So my very first interaction with computer scientists and my very first sort of law in computer science was teaching to the Cybersecurity department, teaching the Computer Misuse Act, which is the UK legislation that deals with computer hacking. And I realised afterwards that I sort of wanted to set up the course that I did and work in this area because that really felt like how not to do law in computer science, because it's not a statute that covers the area it ought to cover. It does prohibit valuable and useful things like penetration testing and your red teaming. You could potentially accidentally fall foul of the act doing that, which would be very problematic. And conversely, it doesn't necessarily catch all the harms that we want to. But the problem with that was that it was enacted as a kind of, hackers, these are a special kind of criminal, we need a new piece of legislation to deal with them. When actually we could have extended criminal damage into digital criminal damage. We could have extended concepts of, trespass and theft into digital trespass and theft, and we didn't need a whole new piece of legislation to do it. So I think we need to think carefully about the regulation we produce. We need to be iterative about it. We need to go back and check we've got it right. But we also need to look at the toolkits that we've already got and not go out there with loads of new regulations that we might get wrong when we've got some tried and tested systems that we could perhaps adapt and develop to use instead.
And where we have legislation, so you mentioned some UK legislation, there's the EU AI Acts as well.
Yeah.
Are you seeing the legislation being, in that battle between sort of regulating and stopping innovation, are you seeing the legislation we currently have being effective?
Well, so you see that battle right at the heart of the EU AI Act, because there are some provisions in it. So there are watermarking provisions, for example, which I'll be very interested to hear your technical thoughts on. But there's also, for example, self-certification, so the ability to declare that your system is compatible with the existing EU rules, which feels to me very light touch in this particular environment. So there's a lot that I like about it. I mean, one of the things I worry about in this country where we don't have it is the lack of transparency. So when I'm trying to work on, what particular system has been used by the government in a particular context, or, what actually is the technology, as Ingmar said, there's lots and lots of different varieties, and actually getting to the bottom of which system has been chosen, trained on which data, and, developed by who, in-house or out of house. That is very difficult to get hold of that information in this country. It does have transparency provisions, which I think are a very good thing, and so some aspects of it are good. But there are other aspects where you definitely see that the battle has been won in one direction or the other. So watermarking is a pro-security win, but self-certification is very much not, I think.
Okay, no, thank you. All sort of huge issues we're grappling with here. Ingmar, it would be crazy to have you on the panel and not talk about your work in robotics, though, and particularly things like autonomous vehicles. Obviously, sort of one of the big things when you co-founded Oxbotica, now Oxa. So talk to us a little bit where you see, particularly things like that, autonomous vehicles going, where you see other sort of robotics maybe being, broadly, change-making for us.
Okay. Before I do that, can I just say I love the idea of beta testing regulation. I think that's a really, really cool thing. Okay, all right. It's been a while since I've actually worked in mobile autonomy, autonomous driving, but one thing that I remember from that time is I'm very cautious when it comes to predicting what happens when. That's why I was saying that. Anyway, it's been a while, but ultimately that the desire to work on something like that, just as is the case for most roboticists and most people who work in technology generally, I think, is really around creating something that somehow benefits society. And yes, that means that doesn't necessarily mean we don't create commercial value and so on. Of course we do, and that's great. But ultimately, a lot of the work that we do in robotics is, as you say, it's about increasing productivity. It's about looking at the demographic problems that are coming our way and trying to see what we can do with that. It's about supporting the workforce and so on. And so a lot of the work that we're doing, so I'm sort of in an interesting position because I'm sort of a machine learning AI guy who applies work in robotics, and I think robotics is a key driver for this sort of technology because agents that act and interact in the real world just pose challenges that we don't necessarily have when we do systems that do logistics or anything like that, or supply chain forecasting, that sort of stuff. That's one thing. But from the application point of view, we're looking at systems, for example, that are able to augment human capacity on the occupational therapist side in care homes, right? And the interesting thing for us on that front is nobody claims that the care system is perfect and we have enough labor for that, and bringing in autonomous systems would massively disrupt that and increase the set of problems that we have. It's actually the opposite, right? We're actually trying to enable people, much like your washing machine enables you to not spend time not washing and do other stuff. We're trying to enable people, carers, to do more of the jobs that they want to be doing and take some of the tedium away from that. That's one aspect that we do. Another thing that we're looking at, and that's very much actually going on right now with Nick and Rob in another room, I think, is environmental survey. So we've become very good in robotics over the past 10, 15 years in having robust systems. You've probably all seen the robot dog, the Boston Dynamics one, which is exceptional, and a bunch of work that is similar to that. We've become very good at equipping this with sensors, knowing where that thing is, sending it around on missions, and measuring stuff. And that's really great because we can measure a whole lot of stuff. We can instrument the world. So, for example, the work that Rob and Nick are doing is about doing agricultural survey. If you're a farmer and you want to know whether your plants or your crop is diseased, if you want to survey biodiversity in your particular environment, but all the way into if you're a city council and you want to know whether currently, where all the potholes are. That's a thing. So it's all fundamentally very similar technology, which we are kind of ready to exploit. So we're doing a lot of that as well. And then there's ancillary work around that, where, particularly on the care side, one thing that I'm excited about, and again, this is not work that I do, that's just work that happens as part of the grant that I lead. This is particularly by Perla Maiolino, a colleague here in Oxford. One of the things that we do during early engagement exercises with stakeholders is we ask them what really moves the needle for them. And in this case, again, with the care home, they said, well, actually, there's a whole bunch of things that a robot could do for us in the home. But they then said, this technology also finds application not necessarily in the administration of care, but also in the education, and that's a key word for us, right? In the education of occupational therapists, particularly around how to physically handle patients. And there are many more applications out there that are super interesting to explore. But ultimately, you asked why we're doing the kind of things that we're doing. It's to augment and amplify human capacity.
And give us a few perspectives on robots as dexterous animals. I mean, how is soft robotics moving, and sort of what are the breakthroughs you think are sort of likely there?
So what are the breakthroughs? So okay. There are a lot of things happening. Soft robotics in particular, we kind of tend to think about that in two aspects, and I have to admit I'm not an expert on that. I wish Perla was here for that. But ultimately, we think about two things that are missing. The first thing is, if we think about our hands, they're sort of weird, right? Because they're kind of squishy, but also not. And that's because they've got bones and they've got tissue around it, and they've got this really amazing thing called skin, which is wonderful for many reasons. One of them is it's super high density, often. In most places, super high density tactile sensing that is flexible and that self-regenerates. I mean, that's just spectacular, right? Because ultimately, if you want tactile sensing, typically we have this like in sort of fingertips on a robot or something like that, right? So that's one thing. So having the notion of something with autonomous skin is one thing that's going on. Soft robotics is sort of very interesting because ultimately you can achieve things that you can't necessarily do with rigid systems. And one of those is actually embodied intelligence in the true sense, in the way that it was originally sort of coined, which is this notion that if you have something soft, I can literally bring it close to a glass and I can basically inflate the fingers, if you think of them as tubes, and will wrap around the glass in a way that will just make it hold the glass. That's the intelligence for that. The intelligence for that is in how the hand was designed. If you do that with a rigid system, it's very, very different. So you have to actually think about exactly how you grasp it. You have to think about grasp poses and all that sort of stuff. So it's a very different world. But rigid systems are very easily characterized. Soft systems, not. And that is one place where machine learning increasingly makes a difference.
Yeah,
that's super interesting.
No, thank you for that. Well, just generally, obviously sitting here in Pembroke and Oxford, where would you say Oxford is in terms of leading the world on robotics at the moment?
Where would I say? So I think that's a really difficult question to answer, because if I say we're the best, then that sounds a bit
That's
weird.
what I wanted to say.
And if I'm saying oh, we're a bit shit, that's also not great. So no, I think so. We have world-leading experts in what we do. So we are present at the top tables across the different disciplines that we do. And I'm happy that my colleagues and I have a part in having built that.
Great, no, thank you. Jen, also, while I was sort of digging into Ingmar's robotics specialist knowledge, I mean, you spent a lot of your career in the military. What do you think is the military dimension with AI at the moment, if you think where budgets are? I mean, given the pressure all governments had, the situation we face at the moment geopolitically, so there may be a general increase in defence spending, but does it need to go in a very different area with the threats we face with AI, do you think?
You know, it's been a while since I've been in the military, but certainly in my experience, the military was always on the cutting edge of how we use new technology. And I know there's a huge amount of thought and investment going into how do we think about just a different way of fighting, for example. Most of the vehicles that the military uses now, whether it's a tank or an airplane, are not unmanned. We certainly have a lot of unmanned vehicles, but the vast majority still have somebody in the driver's seat. I suspect that will change in the next 20 to 30 years, where a lot of these capabilities will be unmanned and controlled by some sort of a remote capability. So there is a lot going in. I think there's a concern about the connectivity with the private sector and the military, because over the past 10 years, there's been a little bit of a backlash at some of the big tech companies on using their capabilities for the military. My friend Alex Karp, who's the CEO of Palantir, actually just wrote a good op-ed on this point. I think it's critical that the military be able to optimize use of these capabilities. But just in the way that the military needs to think about this, really the civilian world, again, these capabilities are being integrated into the full range of civilian infrastructure. And so what I worry about, the biggest threat that we're facing in the US and really around the world, that's a threat that's different in kind, that was illuminated over the past year and a half, is what we've seen as Chinese government cyber actors that have burrowed deep into our critical infrastructure, not for espionage or data theft, but specifically to launch disruptive or destructive attacks in the event of a major conflict in the Taiwan Strait. So this is a world where a war to reunify with Taiwan could well be accompanied by attacks in the US of pollution of water systems, derailing of transportation systems, telecommunications being severed. And so we are very focused in the near term on how we can prevent these capabilities, but also, and that really speaks to deterrence by denial and resilience in our infrastructure, but also how we can deter China and other sophisticated nation-state adversaries from using these capabilities to be able to hold the U.S. at risk, because in many ways where the asymmetry exists is not in operational capability, but frankly in values and ethics. And so our adversaries will be willing to use these capabilities in ways that frankly we and like-minded nations would not. And so when you think about the power, unpredictability, and speed, I think the ethical and values piece of this is one of the most important things.
Thank you. And just bringing that point in an earlier question I asked you back together, you said historically you gave the example of the nuclear age, and we kind of knew what the threats were, we knew what the risks were. Do you worry particularly about non-nation state actors now potentially as a risk?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for many years I did counterterrorism. So I was in the military, deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. I was the head of counterterrorism policy for President Obama from 2013 to 2016, and certainly saw how terrorist groups used even crude technology in ways to have massive amounts of damage. Now you think about, we always when we were focused on Al-Qaeda, we always talked about Al-Qaeda's chief bomb maker. And now you think about Al-Qaeda and ISIS, the chief AI officer, and how they're using those capabilities. And, you know, frankly, we don't, the world is not paying as much attention to terrorism now, but when you think about what's happening in the Middle East, there's, you know, a potential resurgence of terrorist attacks. Certainly we've seen it recently in Russia. And so, again, I think we need to be very deliberate about not suffering another failure of imagination when terrorists or criminals or rogue nations could use even crude examples of generative AI to do significant harm.
Thank you. Really profound thoughts. I'm going to ask Becca a question now. Then I'd like to go to you guys. So actually, Morgan, I don't have a slide. I don't know whether the questions were coming up or not. We may have to go back to good old-fashioned hands up and put the microphone around. You've got them up. You've got them great. Are people up voting as well? Well, here we go. Actually, let's take that one, which is actually what I was about to ask Becca to kick us off on. Do we need to rethink human education and assessment qualifications, given AI is so good at some things? Actually, I mean, obviously, as a teaching fellow here at Pembroke, what's your take on that? Big question.
So yes, is the short answer to a very big question. Yes, we do need to think differently. So one of the things that I think we need to think more about, and this is what I'm doing, so I've set up a course, so 5 years ago when I first got into this, I set up a course in the university which is run jointly between the computer science department and the law faculty. And you can take that course as either a fourth year MSc computer scientist or as a fourth year taught master's law student. And so we have equal numbers of both disciplines in the classroom together, and we absolutely are 100% interdisciplinary to our core. So we always have two people at the front of the classroom as well, one from each discipline as well. And the whole point of sort of setting that up was because I really felt like this was a dimension to legal education that we really needed to cover. So I'm saying before, the absolute first step is to understand the tech, and that includes the lawyers as well as the people developing the tech. And you won't achieve that, you know, if you don't have that kind of interdisciplinarity. So that was the idea behind doing that. But another thing, before we set the course up, we sort of went out into, as part of a UKRI research-funded project, we went out and did a lot of semi-structured interviews with legal services providers, saying, you know, what are the skills gaps that you see? And understanding the technology and thinking about the law and ethics relating to them was obviously one of those skills gaps. But other things were things like mindset. You know, lawyers and computer scientists don't think the same way, and learning to think in a way that means that you can cooperate effectively is really important. Having more commercial skills as a lawyer so that you can think about these trade-offs that you're going to be required to make in practice is another sort of really important thing. Understanding when data is flowing through your fingers, which again as a lawyer you don't realise that if you're doing something over and over again you have the capacity to sort of capture data about that and think about what you're doing. So armed with the sort of knowledge about what it was that lawyers didn't have, we went out and built this completely interdisciplinary course. And we also changed the sort of Oxford norm in the sense that we're not trying to teach people a lot of stuff. We're not, you know, our reading lists are huge. The kind of quantity of knowledge that we test at the end of it is actually quite limited because it's changing all the time. You know, the reading lists change every year. What we're teaching them instead is sort of the instincts to know how to ask questions and which questions are the sorts of questions you should be asking. What are the skills that you need, including the ability to work with somebody of a different discipline and the ability to think about things in the round. So it's much more about giving people lenses to look at things through and skills to handle the information that they have, rather than stuffing them full of information and then saying, right, let's test you on whether you know all of that information that we've stuffed you full of. It really is a very distinct move away from that. And our students sort of say this doesn't look or feel like any of our other courses, and we say, well, no, it's not. We also make them do things practically, so we put them into interdisciplinary groups of 8 for lawyers, for computer scientists, and we say build a thing over the course of the 2 terms of the course. It doesn't have to be great. We're always blown away actually by what they achieve. We started off saying, you know, we'll basically give you Lego bricks that you can put together. You don't need to worry about the user interface. You don't need to, and you know, no, we want to do the user interface. No, we don't want your Lego bricks. We want to do it from the ground up. And they build these amazing, amazing tools, all sorts of different kinds of things, because they found a problem that they think is interesting. They found some technology that might help them to solve it, and they have worked together as a team. So again, very practical set of skills that, again, very unusually for Oxford, does not count at all towards their final mark in the thing. They do that literally just for the love of it, but my goodness, do they do it.
Yeah. Ingmar, do you have a view on how education should change?
So, a bit many actually. I think one of the key aspects of that is not just education about what AI is, but also a basic understanding of how it works. One of the challenges we've had for a long time is the way that AI fails is not like any other failure mode that we've really come across. Like when your toaster goes wrong, you know it and you can sort of empathize with the toast being burnt, right? And pretty sure next time that happens, your toast will still be burnt because your toaster is broken. When AI systems fail, you may not actually realize it for a while, right? And I think there's an educational piece to be done around how to, how to think about that, how to deal with that slightly different way of interacting with technology. I think that's a pretty big piece. And you asked about qualifications. Yeah, there is a question to be asked as to how we actually test knowledge, and that becomes increasingly more philosophical, right? Because in the beginning it was like, well, if you can recite this, great. At this point, AI systems can recite stuff. So therefore, the question is, how do we actually test the notion of critical thinking?
Yeah, that's very good. What about research as well? So you obviously spend a huge amount of time researching. You're researching right in the area, in the hotspot of technology itself. How is technology changing the way you actually conduct research?
A lot, both in good ways and bad ways. For potentially obvious reasons, you may have guessed it, I'm a technology optimist, and I think we stand to gain a huge amount from AI technology, particularly on the research side. So if you're thinking about particularly research into potential solutions to climate change, around material science, around biology, around forecasting, weather forecasting, any of those areas. In fact, I can't really think of an area where that wouldn't be the case. There is a revolution going on in almost all of these areas. Physics is another big one, around how the speed at which we can innovate and find things out. And particularly given some of the really pressing challenges that we face, as a species right now, around the planet, around climate and so on, where time actually matters. We don't have the luxury to take the next 300 years to figure out how to fix this, right? There is a real opportunity here for us to double down and use this for substantive good. And I think one of the balances, going back to many of the things that Jen says, one of the key balances is how do we balance exploration and exploitation without then also, while enabling the innovation to also fulfill that potential.
No, thank you. There's a question up there actually, Mark, which says, what career should Pembroke graduates be pushed towards in the future? I mean, in your area, in your sort of area of science, I mean, what are the scientific areas you would advise future careers?
Forget the AI thing. If you want to do a scientific career, do whatever excites you, because otherwise it's going to be misery. Don't do something that you don't enjoy. I think that's rule number one. If you want to get a career around around exploring AI at this point is so broad that you can do almost anything, and then sort of explore AI around that. If you want to become an AI researcher, you do things like computer science, you do things like math, statistics, and so on. But actually, going back to that research connection, if you want to be somebody who uses AI to address challenges in climate change, for example, at this point we're really good, to the chagrin of many, but just for the right reasons, we're really good at commoditizing the AI tools, right? And that is not without its problems. But what many research directions there are short of is the X. We say AI plus X. So if you want to fix climate, become a climate scientist and then learn how to use AI tools.
Actually, I try and hazard an answer to that as well. The question about what sectors of the economy are going to be most impacted by this. One of the challenges with AI from an employment perspective is it impacts knowledge workers. And in the UK, knowledge work and services more broadly is actually 80% of the economy. And probably the most prestigious historic careers that have been impacted, that have been in this, actually what my career's been in financial services. Because if you actually look at, I draw it as a matrix, I think the two issues you have is, will your job be taken by technology, theoretically, but also can your job still be offshored as well if you work in a richer country like the UK? And that's probably the best lens to put this through. And one of the reasons I think you put it through that lens is that the latest IMF estimates are that about 60% of the jobs in this country are potentially capable of being taken over by machines. Say potentially, doesn't matter that they will, but that figure for emerging markets is at about 30%. And one of the challenges emerging market governments have had in the last 10 to 20 years is worrying about premature deindustrialization. There won't be the manufacturing jobs. There might actually be the lower end knowledge jobs as well to some extent. So a number of emerging market governments, including ones my company is working with, are trying to invest in their education systems and using AI and tools to do that, to actually create offshore knowledge economies. And so that's the paradigm I would think through. So I probably wouldn't advise people to go into what I did, which was join a bank when I left Oxford. We'd have to think critically about some of the other classic professions, probably like law and accountancy and things like what does it mean? What does it mean for those? And generally, I'm not the tech expert, but I think there'll be a lot of opportunities for self-employed humans who've got creativity.
Sorry to jump in there. I may say something slightly controversial now. I think that the job debate is an important one, but I think there is too much emphasis on numbers that we frankly have no idea about how to forecast.
Agreed.
So
Agreed.
my wife is an editor. She sometimes looks at content editing, and if we think about the capabilities of current AI systems, we think, okay, well, is that job going to be around for a while? We don't know, right? But what I can tell you is that, particularly also in that context, and also I suspect in your context, you will still want humans to check what the systems are doing, even if it's just periodically. So you will still want some form of input. The other thing is, for every statistic that I hear about the number of jobs that will be automated away in this country, please add the corresponding statistic for number of jobs that will be created in this country. Because 25 years ago, nobody knew what a web content developer was, right? And now most of my friends seem to be doing it. So
I was going to make a really similar point in the sense that when we started the course, we very much took people who were very separate in the two disciplines. The lawyers looked like me, they'd never done any tech before. Computer scientists never interacted with lawyers or any other social scientists before. Increasingly, and we've always been very open about saying that's absolutely fine. You don't need to know anything previously to do the course. And as the years have gone on, over the 5 years we've run it, we've seen that become blurrier and blurrier. The lawyers are saying, well, actually, I did work in-house for a tech startup, and actually I did do this qualification in computer science along the side. And the computer scientists are saying, well, I'm doing computer science and philosophy, and actually I've got a really strong interest in the law side. And so the lines between those two disciplines are much blurrier than they were 5 years ago when the course started. And we're increasingly seeing people, we talk about sort of lattice career structures, where you don't just go up through a law firm, but you do spend some time in tech and then come back into a law firm as a tech expert in the law firm, and then maybe do some legal qualifications. Or there's really a lot of back and forth and a lot of blending, and as you say, new career paths. Absolutely.
Latest example, prompt engineer.
Yeah, exactly.
It didn't exist 3 years ago for all the right reasons. I'm not convinced it's the best job ever, but it's a thing.
Probably won't
It's
last
a job.
either.
So
But I'm not sure it is controversial, Ingmar, because the question that's posed was, what sectors of the economy might you tell our children to avoid? If you ask me, I'm not pessimistic about jobs. I don't believe that's the issue. I don't believe we should be pessimistic about jobs for 2 or 3 reasons. I mean, sort of the biggest macro reason is to get the whole of human history. We're very good at finding jobs for people, because ultimately governments do not like having people unemployed. You can go back and look at Tudor poor laws, Victorian poor laws, you can look at everything in terms of history. So I think there will be a paradigm where the leaders will ultimately find ways to do useful things with humans. Much more practically, in terms of the jobs debate, we've got a rapidly aging population. So if it's just about you having a job versus you having a satisfying job, our biggest challenge is, will we actually in some areas have enough humans? One piece of analytics we did was to look at all sort of job vacancies in the UK at the moment, and then try and project that forward over the next 20 years based on population changes. And actually, you have to assume that AI is going to take about 40% of jobs before you start running into potential unemployment, just in terms of there being jobs in the economy over the next 20 or so years because of the aging paradigm. But I also agree with you, and back on the third point, I actually think the new jobs are going to be created in many, many, many areas of the economy.
can I just say one quick thing on that? I think the characterization or saying that governments care about having people in employment is actually a fundamental mischaracterization of what they're trying to achieve. So governments care about supporting the people, ideally, and they care about the productivity to be able to have the means to do that, right? And that is something where this technology can help. So if we go back to some basic, and also, I think we should talk about the societal aspects. Regulation is more important, not just because we need to regulate it clearly to avoid harm. It's also important in the context of creating the structures that allow us as societies to live with this new technology, right? And this also addresses or concerns the good aspects of it. If I have the all singing, all dancing AI systems that are now super productive in all ways, then we need to think about things like basic income, because now we can not just afford it, but actually it would be great to supply it to people so they can get on with whatever they want to get on with. And if that is caring for their parents, or great, right?
Can I just jump in on your point? You were going to the societal harms piece. I think, I think we've done a remarkably terrible job of preventing harms from fast-moving technology. I saw a question on there about mental health. I mean, ultimately, yes, we use these tools. They help to enable, they support research, all of that. But more broadly, I think many of the devices that were attached to us have become, weapons of mass distraction. The way we learn, the way we think, the way we write, I think has been, to some extent, our ability to focus, to pay attention, to have a conversation, to create empathy. I think that has been damaged by some of the technology. Remember the whole tagline of move fast and break things. There was very specifically an intent just to get this stuff out there to make money. And you read a book, if anyone's, Jonathan Haidt is an NYU professor who recently wrote a book about the anxious generation and the impacts of social media on our kids, very serious mental health. And so I just look at that as a cautionary tale for how we think about the guardrails that we need to put on AI, and almost sort of, if we had to choose between the optimization of these capabilities versus the mitigation of harms, I would tilt towards the second, despite the misaligned incentives. And this is where I think, governments do have a real responsibility to get involved. I love Becca's point about needing to, in technology, you have sort of agile methodology where you're constantly iterating in terms of how you're developing tech. Now, agile regulatory processes is, probably much more difficult. But the iteration on that, I think, will be absolutely imperative.
I think, Ingmar, were you going to say something?
Yeah, but actually, I'm happy to go after you, but yes, I would.
Just to add that one of the societal harms I really worry about, I've just finished a paper on the automation of universal credit, and one of the societal harms I worry about is that we won't make the use we could of this technology. We will assume that because we're using big data and because that's the sort of direction we're going in, it's all going to be about the line of best fit, and we're not interested in the edge case, and we're not interested in the people who don't fall into the line of best fit. And actually, technology does give us the capacity to deal with that and to be much more sympathetic and complex and nuanced and all sorts of things. But if we start from the presumption of, well, automation is just the survival of the line of best fit, and we won't worry about any of the others, then I think we've got a real problem, and I think that is what we're seeing at the moment. And I think that's another thing we don't really talk enough about. Is the kind of aggregation problem that we're just going to see people in the aggregate rather than as individuals.
Yeah. So just very quickly, I completely agree with basically everything you just said. But I think fundamentally the challenge that we're facing is one of penetration as opposed to the technology development. And I'm not condoning I'm not saying all of that was done well, but the problem with that is reachability, right? The fact that I worry about my daughter's mental health is because, theoretically speaking, she is reachable directly by all of these social media and all that sort of stuff. And yes, we put guardrails around that at home. And I think there's an interesting connection or disconnection between your example around, the nuclear age and nuclear threat, and the evolution of terrorism, and what we are facing now around cybersecurity and so on, because I think the difference is the delivery mechanism, right? So I think one question to be asked is, where do we actually need to focus our attention? Is it necessarily that we need to, guardrail, regulate, etc., the technology development? And I'm not saying we shouldn't, but I think the thing that we're often missing is it's the delivery, how these things are delivered, that we need to be careful about, right?
Can I just answer that really quickly? I mean, I think from our perspective, and we're a technocratic agency, we're taking the approach that, similar to technology, big technology software, if we are ever to make ransomware a shocking anomaly, we need to ensure that technology is designed, tested, delivered very specifically to drive down the number of exploitable flaws and defects, which is not the state of the world today. We've normalized this crazy world where technology comes to us with tens, dozens, hundreds, thousands of vulnerabilities that can be exploited quite easily, frankly. Oh, we can argue about this one all day. But what I'm saying about generative AI capabilities is they need to be built with security as the top priority, and that's really not the case. Although, I'll give some credit to some of the folks in this space. I think DeepMind is thoughtful about this. I think Anthropic is thoughtful with their whole governance mechanism around constitutional AI. So it's not, it's not like we're seeing the leaders in these fields with the same move fast and break things mentality, thank goodness. But things are moving very fast in this space, and I think we have to get ahead of them. You can tell me why I'm wrong.
No, I agree with that. I just think that, the software industry, people are working very hard to stay up to date with, security vulnerabilities. If you want to get rid of ransomware, then, give governments in particular the means, or make governments provide the means to update systems enough so they're not so vulnerable for ransomware.
Yeah, it's not about the developers. We love the developers. It's really more of the big companies that don't have the economic incentives to create that secure software.
Okay.
So.
Okay, good.
We're running up.
No, this is good.
Yeah,
This is
I
good.
like that.
That's after it.
We're running up close to the close of the session. I'll just say, does anybody have a question who wasn't able to grapple with Slido? Gentleman there.
I'm just thinking about it. Fantastic. Listening to all of you. Thinking about AI is basically good for us and bad for us. It seems to me that the application of AI doing things that human beings are really bad at. There's an excellent thing to do with AI. We're really bad at overcoming confirmation bias and being driven by tribal thinking and stuff like that. So my question is, in terms of regulating and controlling AI, is the way you do that to think about the quality of data sets and how data sets are evolved and managed and verified and all that? Think about robotics. Robotics works based on reality. If you just deal with reality, it doesn't work. And AI ought to be, large language models ought to be able to do it, seems to me. What do you think?
I would love to thank you very much, because you asked a question that I would love to be talking about. So I agree. I think the nature of the data sets that these systems are trained on is unbelievably important, because ultimately, fundamentally, these are statistical systems. If it's not in the data, it's not going, or if it's not in the data, or somebody's architected it into the algorithm, the system is not going to know about it. And so this notion of bias and prediction and so on is a huge challenge. And the AI community, and I'm not an expert in this, I should say, but the AI community has taken upon itself to very deeply introspect as to how we can get rid of that, how we can make our systems unbiased. And I think that's a really good effort. I also believe, and this is another slightly controversial thing, so, I also believe that actually it's a fundamentally unfair question to ask of the technology. Because if the data sets are biased, asking the technology to get rid of their bias is interesting, right? So I think there is a really, governance on the government side is one thing. Regulation is an important aspect. But I think there is another really important aspect when it comes to preparing for what's next in AI at the governmental and the institutional levels. And that is looking ahead to the questions that we will want to be answering 5 years from now and saying we need to design the experiment, we need to start thinking about the data sets that we need for this now, such that 5 years from now, when we have our, systems that look at cancer rates or whatever, or even stuff like credit forecasting or anything like that, or social housing, any of that stuff, that we can go and say, these data sets have been gathered by the brightest minds that we have that comes to making sure that this is representative of the population that we're actually dealing with. And I would love to hear more about initiatives at the governmental level that actually look at that.
Yeah, great, thank you very much. Very good question. Anybody else? There's a couple of questions. If we can get to the back, so the hand shot up first. Does anybody have a perspective on that?
I do, but I'm also
Yeah,
happy to.
yeah.
Okay, no, it's not. Where the energy comes from is one thing, but the actual frontier that is currently being exploited is two fronts. One is make the model smaller. So there's a really interesting scientific aspect about this that we have no. We talk about all these models with billions of parameters, which I'm sure you've heard about. We have no idea how many parameters are actually required to do any of that stuff. We don't know whether these models are too big. Well, really not too small, but whether, and if they're too big, by how much, right? So that immediately has an impact. If we had an answer to that, that immediately has an impact on the energy expenditure per query, right? So that matters. The second thing is the computer hardware that is currently being used for this was actually not designed for this. It was designed for something different, gaming, right? And that doesn't take anything away from the likes of NVIDIA. They've done an excellent job at doing this and doing an even better job of protecting it. But there is a very large number of commercial endeavors, startups right now, and a lot of research going into different computational frameworks that do this massively more energy efficiently. So, and I think that will happen way before people come to their senses around the use or otherwise of nuclear energy.
Great, thank you. Maybe we'll take some question down at the front here.
Only now 15 years, only now 15 years after social media, if only now, about 15 years after social media was launched, is our governments like the U.S. Surgeon General starting to want to put warning labels right on social media because of the mental effects, the deaths it's caused. If we can't even control or regulate social media, what is the magnitude of change that we need when AI is arguably magnitudes a lot smarter than social media? How can we control or regulate AI, which is being driven by billions of dollars of private sector money that wants a profit for that investment?
Yeah, I mean, that was sort of my earlier point. I think that's why there are very legitimate concerns about how these technologies can be used, whether it's malicious use or unintentional use, and why. So one thing that I think is somewhat promising, different from 15 years ago, is when GPT-4 was released, there was extensive amount of discussions among governments and extensive interest at the congressional level, at least in the US, on speaking to some of the leaders in these fields. We did not see that at all. Essentially, social media just happened. We all thought, oh, it's going to be great. We can look up our third grade teacher and give our cat a profile, and that'll be fantastic. And now we've sort of learned from that there are very worrying things that this technology can do. So the good news is the world is riveted around the need need to put guardrails in place, the need to regulate. Even the companies themselves, while probably slightly disingenuously are saying they need to be regulated, are at the table having conversations, making at least voluntary commitments in a way that we've never seen from social media. So if there's something to be hopeful about there, my question is, like, are we going to be able to stay ahead of the curve when we start seeing these being used in very malicious ways?
Great, thank you. I'm afraid we've run up on time, so we're going to have to end it. I'm going to end with one really quick question for all of you. So maybe it's a bit of a cliche, but if I start with you, Becca. So where would you be on the spectrum? Are you an AI optimist or an AI pessimist if you think about, will humanity be in a better position 10 to 20 years from now?
I am going to cheat and say it very much depends how we do it and what we use it for. We could, so I'm an optimist. I think it can be done, but I also think it really couldn't be done if we get it all wrong and we don't put in place the guardrails. So I don't think you can answer that question without saying how do we go about doing it.
Ah, okay. Ingmar?
I have to believe it's going to be awesome. Because I mean, what else is there, right?
Yeah.
I also believe it's, for some very challenging questions, it's our only way to make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Jen?
I think it's a responsibility of all of us as leaders, certainly as parents, to really be good ancestors. And I think in that context, pessimism tends to be irresponsible. And so I think all we can do is be optimistic and to work towards achieving that goal.
Good answer, brilliant. Well, thank you. And a round of applause for this fantastic panel.